Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Alex. I'm with the Scholar, and as always, I am live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at the bookstore. Thank you for tuning in this evening as we welcome Scott LaMar and Alan Guelzo to virtual Harrisburg. To our viewers out there, thank you for supporting our authors. Thank you for supporting indie bookstores, and we hope you enjoy this evening's program. But at this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers here this evening to you. Our interviewer is Scott LaMar. Scott has worked in both radio and television for more than 4 decades. Currently, LaMar is the host and executive producer of the Daily Smart Talk News and Public Affairs program on WITF FM 89.5 and 93.3 in Harrisburg. LaMar was a regular contributor to BBC World News TV before and after the 2020 US presidential election. The American Society of Civil Engineers honored LaMar with their National Excellency in Journalism Award in 2020. LaMar has won more than a dozen Pennsylvania Associated Press Broadcast Awards since 2000 and has been nominated for 5 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards. LaMar and Smart Talk have been recognized throughout Central Pennsylvania community, including the ADVOZ, Lancaster's first Dignity in Dialogue Award, the South Central Assembly's Regional Citizen Award, and was named a humanitarian hero by the Humane Society of the United States, Pennsylvania. A native of Coatesville, Pennsylvania, LaMar has also worked as a broadcast news anchor, sports play-by-play announcer, and manager. Of course, our featured author this evening is none other than Dr. Alan Guelzo. Guelzo is a senior research scholar at the Council of Humanities at Princeton University. He is the author of several books about the Civil War and early 19th century American history, and he has been the recipient of the Lincoln Prize 3 times, the Guggenheim Lerman Prize for Military History, and many other honors. He lives in Pennsylvania. Of course, Guelzo's new book that we are here for this evening is titled Robert E. Lee, A Life. I've got to read just one blurb, and this one comes from a friend of the bookstore, Andrew Roberts, who writes, quote, Alan Guelzo confirms his place in the top rank of Civil War historians with his masterly biography of Robert E. Lee. Well-researched, well-written, and captivating, it will stand as a definitive single volume for decades to come, end quote. Some quick housekeeping before we get started. If you have a question for Alan at any point, please use the Q&A button towards the bottom of the screen below our faces here. We'd love to hear from you, so ask away at any point, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible towards the end of the program. And lastly, most importantly, if you are interested in purchasing a signed copy, these are all signed copies of Robert E. Lee, A Life, we'd love for you to consider purchasing it through your host bookstore this evening, the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. That is the #1 way to support this event series and programming. Again, we have exclusive signed copies available, so look in the chat room in just a moment, and I'll provide a link there for you, or simply head to our website at midtownscholar.com. But now, without further ado, Scott LaMar and Alan Guelzo.
Thanks, Alex. Dr. Guelzo, always a pleasure talking with you. Just from a personal point of view, I always learn so much just from our conversations, but the book, just a treasure of information about Robert E. Lee that I'm sure many historians aren't aware of. You know, many times when I'm discussing a biography with an author, there will be some chronology to that person's life, but I'm going to skip that this time. Then we'll get into some of Lee's early life, but there are a couple really important questions that I had about Robert E. Lee. The story has always been when Lee resigned his commission from the U.S. Army at the beginning of the Civil War, that he said he wouldn't raise his sword against his native state, Virginia. You have the most exhaustive description of what took place during that time. And the one thing that I'll tease the audience with is it wasn't as simple as just raising his sword against Virginia. What happened?
Well, first of all, Scott, let me say what a pleasure it is to be back and talking to you and with people at Midtown Scholars Bookstore and also with WITF. And maybe you'll give me a chance to say a quick hello and shout out to my old friends at Gettysburg College, at the Gettysburg Foundation, and the Gettysburg Civil War Roundtable as well. All of these are people who are very important and have always been very important to me. But Robert E. Lee, for a long time, Scott, I really approached the question of Lee's decision very much the same way. I had read in many sources and assumed from those sources that Lee's decision was a a straight up one-off affair. One day he was thinking one way. The next day he decided to go in a 180-degree opposite direction. And the more that I pressed on that, the less likely that story turned out to be. I'd actually started to write about that particular moment in Robert E. Lee's life to call it the decision. But the more that I worked on it, I realized I really had to call it the decisions, because there was a series of decisions, not all of them quite as obvious as it might seem. And Lee's movement to what finally became his decision to join the Confederacy was really a series of incremental decisions. Robert E. Lee, before the spring of 1861, had for more than 30 years been an officer of the United States Army. He'd been an engineering officer for the most part. He'd been in the Corps of Engineers until the mid-1850s. And then from 1855 until 1861, he had been the lieutenant colonel of the 2nd United States Cavalry on the Texas frontier. When he is called to Washington in March of 1861, when everything looks like it's really beginning to come apart at the seams over secession and slavery, Lee wondered almost to himself what the real purpose in his recall to Washington was. Officially, it was to come and help rewrite the regulations of the United States Army. He suspected something else was at work, and he was right. The General-in-Chief of the Army, Winfield Scott, had been Lee's commander in the Mexican War. He thought extremely highly of Lee. He believed, in fact, that if he, as he once said, if he'd been laying on his deathbed, Winfield Scott would point to Robert E. Lee as the man to succeed him. Well, now, brought together with Abraham Lincoln and with William Henry Seward and with Secretary of War Simon Cameron, the decision is made to present Lee with the opportunity to take command of whatever federal forces are going to be needed to deal with the secession crisis. And the person who is nominated to make the presentation is that wonderful political engineer in Washington, Francis Preston Blair Sr., probably one of the oldest, most veteran Washington political hands you could imagine. And Lee goes to meet with Blair in April of 1861. Blair makes the offer and Lee refuses. Now, the general answer in 1861 from Robert E. Lee was that he couldn't accept this command, that he was a Virginian. And when Virginia seceded from the Union, as it was in the process of doing, even as he and Blair were conferring at what today we call Blair House, across from the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue, when Virginia seceded from the Union, he insisted he was obliged to follow Virginia into the Confederacy. He could not, as he said, draw his sword against Virginia. But was he really obliged to follow Virginia? Was that really the path of duty? Now, it's true, Robert E. Lee was born on the northern neck of Virginia in 1807. So there's a little chronology there, Scott. And he'd grown up in Alexandria, which we consider to be Virginia. The problem is that when he grew up in Alexandria, Alexandria was then a part of the District of Columbia. Alexandria and that northern strip of Virginia along the Potomac would only be retroceded to Virginia in the 1830s, long after Lee had left. Most of Lee's life thereafter had been lived in other places, in Georgia, in St. Louis, in Baltimore, in Texas, in New York City. He actually spent more consistent time in New York than almost any other state in his life. And he was doing so as an Army engineer. What's more, his father, the famous Light Horse Harry of Revolutionary fame, Light Horse Harry Lee had politically been a Federalist. And Federalists were politically people who supported the idea of the supremacy of the nation over the states. And Light Horse Harry had suffered for it politically. Now, even though Robert E. Lee marries into one of the foremost families of Virginia, the Custuses of Arlington, The Custuses were Whigs, and like the Federalists, they valorized the nation first and Virginia afterwards. And what's more, Arlington sits on a bluff overlooking the Potomac, facing the national capital, not facing Virginia. Now, what Lee could not ignore when he's presented with this offer are two factors. First of all, Light Horse Harry Lee, his father, for all of his revolutionary fame, had been a real hard luck husband and father. And he left his family for the West Indies when Robert was only 6 years old. The shadow that Light Horse Harry cast over the Lee name was something that Robert spent his whole life trying to redeem. So for him, what he has to do is try to pursue independence, to stand on his own 2 feet as his own man, not in the shadow of his father. He's got to search for security, and he'll find that security in the army. And he will search for perfection, because he is going to redeem the reputation of the Lee name. He's going to be the perfect Lee that his father was not. The hinge factor in all of these pursuits was Arlington. And it was as much to protect Arlington for his family as it was for Virginia that he chose to resign his commission and refuse the offer of command from old Francis Preston Blair. Now, that's one major factor. The other factor in Lee's decision was the very surprisingly widespread expectation that there wasn't going to be any war after all. Now, it's hard for us to appreciate this because we think in April of 1861, 7 states have seceded from the Union. Fort Sumter is fired upon. 4 more Southern states secede from the Union. Lincoln calls out the militia, and the war is on. So we look at that and we think, well, that's inevitable. The crisis of secession could only result in a civil war. Well, in that kind of case, Lee could simply have resigned and stayed neutral. Or what's just as likely, if not more likely, and this emerges from conversations that he had with family members, principally his cousin, Cassius Francis Lee in Alexandria. If there's no absolute certainty that there's going to be a war, he, Robert E. Lee, can go to Richmond, accept the command of Virginia forces that's offered to him, and play the role of mediator between Virginia and the Union. And by so doing, he would achieve, by peacemaking, a fame greater than his father had ever enjoyed. So with that level of uncertainty, he's willing to go to Richmond, but like many others, when he gets there, he finds that the secession crisis has galloped away from him. And in the end, step by step by step, he finds himself by 1862 as the commander of the principal Confederate field army in the East, the Army of Northern Virginia. But it's an incremental process, step by step.
And the best explanation, most exhaustive investigation into that question that I think many historians have ever heard. Okay, so here's the next big question. Did Robert E. Lee commit treason when he resigned his commission in the U.S. Army and joined the Confederacy?
Yes. Now, I don't say that lightly, and I don't say it because I enjoy throwing a big, ugly word around. I say it because, first of all, when I look straight at the Constitution and the Constitution's description and definition of treason, that of giving aid and comfort to the enemies of the United States, making war against the United States. I am sorry, but I cannot cut things any other way. What he did was the commission of treason as defined by the Constitution. And I can't turn my eyes away from it. And I don't think that other people should either. Now, I say that as looking at the Constitution. I also say it in a personal context, because Robert E. Lee, when he was commissioned in 1829, took an oath. It was an oath to the United States of America, to protect the United States of America, to obey the orders of the President of the United States. He took that oath and he went back on it. Now, my father took that oath. My son who was a captain in the Army, took that oath. I took that oath when I became a member of the National Council for the Humanities. And I take that oath seriously. When I look at someone who likewise took the oath and turned his back on it, when he did that, he raised his hand against the Constitution, against the United States, against the flag. He raised that hand against me. And I have to define it in those terms.
He actually was charged with treason right after the war, right?
At the very end of the war, he is indicted for treason by a federal court sitting in Norfolk, Virginia. Norfolk was one area of Virginia which had been returned to federal control as early as the spring of 1862. And federal control had been solid enough there that they were able to restart a federal court system. And the federal court judge there, John C. Underwood, he was a man, he was actually born in the North, but he owned property in Virginia. He had been on the sharp end of persecution from secessionists. He had it in for Robert E. Lee, and he obtains an indictment from a grand jury, an indictment for treason for Robert E. Lee. Now, it's never brought to trial, but the indictment is there, and that indictment hangs like a cloud over Lee's head until Christmas Day of 1868, when President Andrew Johnson issues a general amnesty that dispels any consequences of that indictment. But for several years, Robert E. Lee has to live with the prospect that, having been indicted for treason, he could at any moment find himself served for a trial, and a trial which could have very unpleasant consequences.
Well, you used the word hanging over his head. The word hanging is
Yeah, that's an unintended
I was going to say,
metaphor, but
maybe
yes.
that's not misplaced.
Right.
You said that in 1861 that Lee was doubtful that it actually was going to come to combat. But throughout the war, one of the things that struck me in the book is that he was very pessimistic about the Confederates' chances of winning. And one of the reasons that he complained throughout the war and even after the war was that he felt that the South, the Southern people, just didn't give it their all.
Right.
We'll talk about that a little bit.
His feeling was that they had embarked on this project, this secession project, without counting the cost, and thereby involving themselves and everybody in the southern states in potential ruin. And he is constantly railing at the Confederate leadership, both on the government, the federalized level, but also on the state level, about their half-heartedness, about the ease with which they thought victory was going to be accomplished, how they thought it could all be won on somebody else's dime, how they could adopt some kind of defensive posture, that they were going to defeat the North the way the Russians defeated Napoleon by drawing them further and further into their territory. And Lee says, this is all folly. This is all folly. The North has so much of a reservoir of strength, of materials, of substance, that the South cannot possibly win on those terms, and we should wake up and smell the coffee. His advice is consistently, take the war northwards. He understood the power that the North represented. He understood that the South could not go a full, long, heavyweight bout, 15 rounds. If the South was going to win in its independence, it was going to have to score a surprise knockout in the first or second round. And that is why in 1862, once he has rescued Richmond from the threat of George McClellan, he bounds northwards across the Potomac into Maryland, heading for Pennsylvania. He doesn't make it to Pennsylvania. The story of that is bound up in the famous Lost Orders of September 1862. But even though that planned campaign into Pennsylvania is cut short in 1862, in 1863, he's back to it again. And this time there's no lost orders. He moves through Maryland into Pennsylvania. And the object of doing so is he can quite possibly fight a battle on Northern soil and win it. And especially if it's George McClellan in command, he thinks he can win it. If he wins a battle like that on Northern soil, that is going to have such political repercussions in the North that politicians and people in the North will demand that the Lincoln administration open peace negotiations with the Confederacy. But even if there is no battle, just the idea that a Confederate army could roam at will across Pennsylvania, hello, Harrisburg, hello, Lancaster, without any seeming opposition from a worthwhile federal army, that in itself would cause the same kind of political havoc. And once again, that would bring the Lincoln administration to peace negotiations. Once peace negotiations are opened, no one's going to go back to fighting. Once there's an armistice, no one's going back into this war. And Lincoln is going to be forced to recognize the independence of the Confederacy. And Lee really believes that is the strategy that is going to win independence for the Confederate States of America. He's constantly pushing that and constantly criticizing people in the Confederacy who don't seem to have enough gumption to want to support it and push it forward.
You've got to explain the lost orders a little bit more for those that don't know the story, because history may have changed on Lee's orders that were lost.
Almost exactly those words are the words used by one of Lee's staff, one of his military secretaries, Walter Heron Taylor, in his memoir of 4 years with General Lee. He says, on the loss of these orders, it just seemed like God had made the whole future of the war hinge. What were the lost orders? The lost orders were the campaign orders Lee issues to all of his division commanders in the Army of Northern Virginia as they're moving into Maryland. And these orders describe how Lee has divided his army. Part of his army has moved northwards to Hagerstown, ready to move into Pennsylvania. The other half of his army has moved to encircle and besiege Harper's Ferry, which still has a federal garrison in it. And the idea is that Harper's Ferry is going to be reduced by the siege and captured. That half of the Confederate army will rejoin Lee at Hagerstown, and off to Pennsylvania they go. A copy of those campaign orders was picked up on September 13th, the morning of September 13th, 1862, by several soldiers from the 27th Indiana. They had stopped on their march. They fell out. They were cooking up their coffee. They were lounging around, and some of them notice in the grass some rolled up paper around 3 cigars. And these soldiers, that's a sergeant and a corporal, they look at this. They never said what they did with the cigars, by the way. You use your imagination. But they look at this and they realize, oh my goodness, this is important. They go to the colonel of their regiment. The colonel of the regiment goes to the head of their corps, 12th Corps. One of the staffers on the 12th Corps reads the orders and says, this is legitimate. I recognize the handwriting of Lee's chief of staff, Robert Chilton, because this particular staffer had been in Detroit at the same time Chilton was, when Chilton had to make bank deposits. He was a bank teller. So he recognized, there's a guy there who can recognize the handwriting and authenticate it. The orders then go off to McClellan's headquarters. And George McClellan, as commander of the Army of the Potomac, looks at these orders and says, I now know what Lee's plans are. If I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home. And he lurches into unaccustomed vigor. One thing George McClellan was not noted for was moving fast. Well, now that he knows this, he moves fast, pushes past the Confederate outposts on South Mountain, forces Lee to back up against the Potomac, and the result is the Battle of Antietam on September 17th, 1862. It cuts off any possibility of Lee heading up into Pennsylvania, and that, in fact, will not take place for another year. That's, of course, what leads to the Battle of Gettysburg. But that's the lost orders.
We've probably heard more about Robert E. Lee in the past 4 years than we did in the 75 years before that. Much of that has to do with the nation's awakening to symbols of the lost cause and how they related to slavery, racism, and white supremacy. So I have to ask this question. Why did you want to write about Lee?
I started work on this project. And by the way, that is a question I've asked myself a good deal. in the ensuing years. I started work on this project after I'd finished Gettysburg, The Last Invasion in 2013. And I started work on this, on a biography of Robert E. Lee, first of all, because, out of curiosity, because I'm a Yankee from Yankee Land. All right, I'm a Pennsylvania boy, and I'd never looked at the Civil War really in any extended way through the eyes of the Confederacy. I thought, all right, well, maybe this is an opportunity to take a look at the Civil War through the other end of the telescope, see what it looks like. So curiosity, but there was also another kind of curiosity because I was intrigued by the question, how do you write the biography of someone who commits treason? And I asked that question because a lot of the times when you write biography, I've spent a lot of time writing about Abraham Lincoln. Believe me, that is not difficult to do because you can admire Abraham Lincoln. And you can do likewise for Ulysses Grant. You can do likewise for Winston Churchill. But there are other to write a biography about because there's so many obstacles in the path of empathy. And I looked at this in the case of Robert E. Lee, and I thought, how would one go about writing a biography of Robert E. Lee, especially when you believe that Robert E. Lee has committed treason? How do you write a book like that? So I set to work on this at a time when Lee was still, by and large, he was a figure out of Civil War history. Then came Charlottesville in 2017. And then subsequent to that, so many other disturbances, so many other questions, so much trauma. And as I worked through this project, I'm watching this build, and you might say the image of Robert E. Lee is undergoing a dramatic shift. Statues of Lee are being removed. The image of Lee is being questioned. I actually said to my editor at one point, should we put this manuscript in the freezer for a while until the climate of opinion seems to just alter a little bit? But his response was no. No, he said, this is a very humane biography of Lee, and we like it here, and we want to go forward with it. We think it'll be one of the big biographies of the year. So, all right, he knows the business much, much better than I do. So I thought, all right, well, we'll go ahead with it. And so the book is now here, and people can make a judgment on it by having it in their hands and reading it. But the process of it was fraught with more than a little anxiety, Scott, because you have to wonder, what kind of a message do people think you're sending by writing a biography of Robert E. Lee? A biographer is someone who has to enter into the life of their subject to understand them. And one of the temptations of doing that is your empathy can become sympathy. And you can find yourself acting not as a biographer, but as an apologist. That's a serious danger for biographers. Another danger is that even if you avoid that, you could be perceived that way. But the solution is not to go in the other direction. The solution is not to adopt a sneer, because in its own way, that is fully as contemptuous of history as the people who want to put halos around historical figures. Historical figures are like you and I. They had the same problems, they had the same torments, they have faced the same kinds of difficulties and decisions about big questions. And it's not a question in biography of whether you paint halos or whether you paint horns. It's how do you understand the people themselves as they are trying to act, and how do you make a judgment about them? For me, the guiding formula was a formula that I had read years before in the writings of a literary critic, not a historian. I was stepping out of my discipline, which frankly I do a lot because I have this wildly insouciant disregard for disciplinary boundaries. So I'm a historian who will stray into philosophy, into religion, all kinds of stuff like that. I never saw a historical boundary that I didn't feel like transgressing. I'd been guided by the wisdom of John Gardner as a literary critic when he said, there can be no true will without compassion, and no true compassion without will. In other words, you have to make judgments about people when they have done right or wrong. You have to make those judgments. But you can't make those judgments alone. You have to make them also out of a spirit of compassion and understanding. And the real challenge is, how do you make those two meet and work together? If there is any other single challenge in writing a biography, whether it's Robert E. Lee or anyone else, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Frederick Douglass, making those two things meet and balance, true will and compassion, true compassion and will. That's the real challenge of writing difficult biography.
Well, some of the things in Lee's life that you write about do bring up some tough questions, especially in light of how we are looking at Lee's life today. What were his thoughts on slavery?
Lee had learned as a soldier not to get involved in politics. He had seen two of his father figures, so to speak, in military life get nearly, one ruined and the other nearly ruined by touching the political rail. And he pulled almost pathologically shy of talking about politics for most of his life. But by the mid 1850s and the late 1850s, he can't avoid it. And so for the first time, he starts to talk about slavery. Now, you might think by that point, hey, this is a little late, Mr. Lee, because when he's born in 1807, his parents own slaves. They don't own many because the reduced circumstances of the Lee family living in Alexandria were such that they didn't own many. They own 6, perhaps at most, but they own slaves. Whether it's 6 or 1, that's still an involvement in slavery. Lee inherits one slave family from his mother after her death in 1829. But he never owns any other slaves in his own name. Now, some people have said, oh, well, see, that gets him off the hook. He's not really deeply involved in slavery. No, wait. He marries Mary Custis. Now, this is one of the first families of Virginia. And the Custises at Arlington and the other Custis properties in Virginia, they own something like 190 slaves. So Lee didn't have to own slaves in his own name, but he was still benefiting from the slave system because of his wife's family. So that becomes the background for when he starts talking about slavery for the first time in the 1850s. And what he says is very peculiar. He says, slavery is a moral and political evil in any country. Now you look at that and you think, well, now there's a statement. And then he at once pivots and says, yes, but you know something? There's not really too much we can do about it. All we can expect is slow incremental improvement, because that's the way things really take place. It took 2,000 years for Christianity to civilize the Roman Empire and Europe and modern life. And it's going to take a good long while before we live ourselves out of slavery. In fact, he'll go on to say that slavery actually is more of a problem for white people than it is for Black people. Because at least Black people have benefited from being brought out of Africa and being brought up as Christians, whereas whites, all that slavery has done is degrade them. I was thinking, this is a very odd way to look at slavery. It's more of a problem for white people than Black people? Yeah, right. This is how Lee describes this. So on the one hand, here is someone who is clearly dicey on the subject of slavery, who knows that it's wrong, and yet who won't do anything about what he knows. I mean, it's like looking at something which is wrong and then looking away, as if you want to wish it away. And this becomes how Lee governs his responses to slavery right up to the edge of the Civil War. Now, the funny thing is this. Once he becomes the famous General Lee of the Confederacy, he harangues Jefferson Davis about the need to emancipate the slaves, because he says slavery is a millstone around the Confederacy's neck. We will never succeed as a nation. Certainly, we're not going to be able to entice other foreign nations to assist us if we persist in holding slaves. We need to get rid of slavery. Now, that's a testimony that he said about himself talking to Jefferson Davis. And you might think, well, yeah, he would say that after the war. Except that one of the Arlington slaves, once the war begins and Arlington is occupied by federal forces, one of the Arlington slaves, the man, in fact, who had been Lee's valet, Philip Meredith, just escapes over the river into the District of Columbia and benefits in April of 1862 from the Emancipation Bill that Congress passes for the district. He applies to the Emancipation Commissioners and for his manumission, and they take down from him his story, quote unquote, because they're all agog at the fact this was Robert E. Lee's valet. He said to him, yes, and Robert E. Lee told me that he wished I was a free man and he wished that no one had ever held slaves. Oh my goodness, this is Robert E. Lee. Then by the end of the war, February of 1865, Lee drops the bombshell. The Confederacy is there with its back against the wall. What's going to save it? Lee says, emancipate the slaves and recruit them into the Confederate Army. Oh, you could have heard the Confederate hardliners clutching their chests and falling forward on their desks. One of them, Howell Cobb, a senator, said, well, if this is the right way to do things, then our whole theory has been wrong as the Confederacy. And the fire-reading newspaper for fire readers to read accuses Lee of never having been in favor of the Confederacy. Lee was always unreliable. Lee was always a Federalist. Lee was always half-hearted. You're thinking, wait a minute, this is the Charleston Mercury writing about Robert E. Lee? And the answer is yes, because people had the sense that Lee was dicey about slavery. And they sensed that, and his comments in February of 1865 only go forward to confirm that. So Lee's relationship to slavery, there's no single way to characterize it, except to say it looks like a question mark.
One of the myths that came out of the Lost Cause was that there actually were African-American slaves that were fighting alongside their masters. And that is a myth. But what you just talked about, again, one of those little lost facts of the Civil War is that Robert E. Lee was recommending this. I want to take some questions from some of our viewers and listeners here in just a few minutes, but I want to ask about Robert E. Lee, the soldier. Was he this great tactician, strategist? Was he this great commander that he was made out to be? I mean, Chancellorsville, Virginia, probably his high point. Third day at Gettysburg with Pickett's charge, probably his low point. Was he a great military man?
Well, I think he was, but you have to parse the word great, because what makes military leaders great is really a composite of three things. Military leaders have to be either A, a great strategist, or B, a great tactician. In other words, you're very good at disposing of the situation as it is immediately on the battlefield, whereas strategy is the big picture. Or third, you're a good logistics person. You're a good operational manager. Great leaders have been those who have been able to combine all three. Very good leaders have been able to combine two. Good leaders have specialized in one. Robert E. Lee was a great strategist. He, beyond any other major figure in the Confederacy, understood what the real strategic picture for the Confederacy was and acted on it. It's less easy to see him as a great tactician because, for one thing, he didn't see his job as primarily a tactical job. He saw his principal responsibility as strategic. As he put it to the Prussian military observer, Justus Scheibert, he said to Scheibert, my job is to get my army to the battlefield, and then my lieutenants take over. Now, his lieutenants in this case that he was referring to were Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet. So his idea is he creates the strategic environment, gets things to the tactical level, and then turns it over to Longstreet or Jackson or both, and they will execute the tactical work. That doesn't mean that he didn't have tactical insight, but it means that it was something he didn't particularly want to do himself. Well, that works at Chancellorsville. Now, it also works at Second Bull Run. It works when he's got Jackson and Longstreet, but he loses Jackson after Chancellorsville, and he effectively loses Longstreet after the Wilderness. And after that, the people that he has to work with are of mediocre quality at best. And increasingly, Lee has to take on the tactical oversight of the Army of Northern Virginia. And it's very clear he's not comfortable in doing it. That's not the kind of thing that he likes to do. He is probably least adept as an operational or logistical manager. And I say that largely because he was so allergic to involvement in the political confrontation. And the problem is a good operational or logistical manager knows how to handle the politicians, because it's the politicians who are going to supply the wherewithal, the ammunition, the clothing, the shoes, the support. Lee did not want to get involved with the politicians. And for that reason, he will give only the most tangential oversight to logistical questions. And the difficulty is then his army suffers for it. The ordinary soldiers suffer from want of clothing, of blankets, of equipment, of shoes. I mean, it's just chronic in the Army of Northern Virginia. And that's largely because that would have forced Lee into political confrontations with people in Richmond that he preferred to avoid. So high marks as a strategist, decent marks as a tactician, not so good marks as a logistician or operational manager.
Let's take some questioners from listeners. Joshua wants to know, what was the most surprising thing you learned about Robert E. Lee during your research for the book? Something that perhaps pushed back against the narrative you may have thought about Lee going into writing the book.
His presidency of Washington College after the war.
Now Washington and Lee.
That's right. Most of the time, the last 5 years of Lee's life, from 1865 until 1870, are treated as a coda that biographers get through as quickly as they can, because all the really interesting stuff in Lee's life has already happened and finished at Appomattox. So now the only next big stopover is, well, a funeral. So those last 5 years become something that get very compressed and treated in a very dismissive fashion. I think that's a big mistake. And that's one thing I learned, not only looking closely at Lee as a college president and asking why he became one, but also spending a lot of time with some very wonderful people at Washington and Lee University and in their special collections. I mean, especially I have to praise my friend Lucas Morell at Washington and Lee, acting as a host, and the special collections staff at the Labor and Library at Washington and Lee. They gave me access to just marvelous reams of material from the trustees and from Lee's own writing. What I learned in the process was that Robert E. Lee was a very unlikely candidate as a college president. He had been superintendent of West Point for 3 years, hated every minute of it because he was micromanaged all the time. It was very unlikely then, when the trustees of Washington College made this pitch to him in the late summer of 1865 to become their president, that he would accept. Why would he do that? He didn't really like this kind of work. He accepts it, first of all, because it's in Lexington, Virginia. It's about as far away from Washington and Richmond as he can get without violating the terms of his Appomattox parole. What's he doing? He's trying to get away from that treason indictment. He's trying to get out of the public view where people can point fingers at him. So he comes to Lexington. The trustees think what they've acquired is someone who's going to be a great name on the letterhead. And in fact, one of Lee's former generals, Isaac Trimble, writes to the trustees and congratulates them and said, hey, it's great. You've got Lee as the president. Don't give him too much work to do. Just let him be the face of the college and everything will be fine. Ha, 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 ha. You know what happened? The trustees became the figureheads. Lee took over the management of Washington College and he turned it upside down. He took a college that was almost pulseless at the end of the war. In 5 years, he's got over 400 students there. It's a rival to the University of Virginia. He's built the endowment up to $250,000. And in those days, $250,000 was a lot of money. And what's even more, he's built the faculty, but built it by pushing to the margins the traditional classical education, the Latin and the Greek. He brings in all kinds of professional, vocational majors. He's going to have instruction in mechanical engineering, in bridge building, even in journalism. He is, in that respect, one of the most progressive college presidents in terms of educational theory and practice that you can find in post-Civil War America. And he is a fabulous success as a college president. I think in many respects, the last 5 years of Robert E. Lee's life were actually the happiest years of his life. Because, I'd said earlier that he looks for these three things: independence, security, perfection. He gets to have them all as president of Washington College. And if it were not for the fact that his health was in such serious disrepair, I think he could have gone on from there to have become one of the preeminent educational leaders of the post-war years. That gets cut short when he suffers a stroke in 1870. But what a remarkable 5 years. It is the most surprising aspect of Robert E. Lee's life.
David wants to know regarding the potential to have Lee tried for treason. It's one thing to gain an indictment from a grand jury, but another to get a conviction from a jury of his peers. Jefferson Davis was indicted in Richmond. The Johnson administration declined to prosecute either case. Do you think it's possible that a jury of Virginians in Norfolk might have convicted Robert E. Lee?
Probably not. First of all, the trial would not have taken place in Norfolk. The trial would have taken place in Richmond, largely because one of the specifications in the Constitution is that trials of this sort have to take place in the venue where the offense was committed. So that would have meant Richmond. And even John Curtis Underwood admitted, you're not going to find 12 Richmonders who are going to condemn Robert E. Lee. Underwood made this comment: it would be more likely that the jury would hail him as the equivalent of George Washington instead of voting to convict. So that, in fact, turns out to be one reason why the indictment never, in fact, goes to a trial, because there would have been some serious difficulty. The government, the federal government, would have put him on trial and run the risk of a serious loss of face if, in going to trial, they couldn't obtain a conviction of Robert E. Lee. Talk about egg all over the face of the Attorney General and over the President of the United States. At that point, of course, Andrew Johnson's got enough egg on his face anyway from a number of other causes. He didn't need more trouble like that from Lee. But there's really a few other things which enter into why the indictment never goes to trial. One is Ulysses Grant. When Ulysses Grant hears that Johnson is considering moving through the indictment to a trial, Grant goes to Johnson and he says very frankly to him, look, at Appomattox, the deal was the Confederate Army would surrender and surrender as an army. It would surrender intact. It wouldn't try to head for the hills and carry on a guerrilla warfare. In return for that, I gave everybody in Lee's army, including Lee, a parole. We have to observe that parole. Now, Johnson's Attorney General, James Speed, objected and said, wait. That's only a parole as a military officer. That doesn't really have any legal standing. At that point, Grant turned around and said to Johnson, if you proceed to a trial of Robert E. Lee, I will resign as General-in-Chief of the Army. Well, politically, that was too expensive for Andrew Johnson. He couldn't do that. Johnson backs off. They back off the indictment, and it never goes to trial. There's a couple of other legal entanglements as well. I won't take us into the legal weeds with them, but for at least 4 separate reasons, 2 of which we've touched on here, the indictment never goes to trial. And as I said, Lee finally is amnestied on Christmas Day of 1868.
Robert wants to know, do you think Lee's strategic vision of winning a key battle on Northern soil was the correct one? Was it the correct strategy? Or would have he had a better chance of success to bleed the Union armies to the point where the people of the North did not want to continue the war?
He didn't believe that the Confederacy could conduct a defensive, discouraging war like that. And for him, the proof was in the pudding. Look what was happening in the West. The Confederacy kept losing battles. It kept fighting defensively, but it kept losing battles and losing territory. Every time it lost a battle, every time it lost territory, the Northern war effort gained more confidence. And ultimately, it gains the most confidence because of the victories by Ulysses Grant in the West at Vicksburg and then at Chattanooga in 1863. So Lee looks at that and says, that's no way to win the war. That's simply laying down and letting the Union trample all over you. He didn't even see that happening in the Eastern Theater because he looked at the victories that his army won. And these are victories, these are not defeats. These are victories at Chancellorsville, at Fredericksburg in December of 1862, and then Chancellorsville in May of 63. And Lee says, after those battles, I was depressed. I was depressed because, yes, we had defeated the Federal Army of the Potomac on 2 occasions, but all they did was withdraw to the other side of the Rappahannock. They stayed in Virginia, and they would go and recruit more soldiers, and they would be back a few months later. Our resources would be depleted. We would just be eventually ground down. And he says, we can't win a war like that. It's inevitable. So what we have to do is we have to bound northwards on our own, go on the offensive, win either a battle on Northern soil, or at least run around loose in the North, especially in Pennsylvania, in such a way as to say, look, the Federal armies are incapable of tracking down and defeating a Confederate army. They're incapable of defending Harrisburg and Lancaster and York and perhaps even Philadelphia. As soon as Northerners begin to think that way, then they'll lose heart. I mean, Lee took the view this way, politically speaking. In the fall of 1862, after Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln's party gets shellacked in the fall elections. Lincoln's party loses something like 35 seats in the House of Representatives. It also loses 2 key governorships of New York and New Jersey. Now that's the fall of 62. In the fall of 63, the governorships of Pennsylvania and Ohio were up for re-election. And there were serious Democratic contenders for those elections. If Lee could demonstrate the weakness of the Lincoln administration, then in the fall of 63, Pennsylvania and Ohio would go Democratic as well. Think then, you would have the central core of the northern states, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, in the hands of anti-Lincoln administrations. Together, they could fold their arms and say, we are not contributing one more man, we're not contributing one more dime, we're not contributing one more horse to this ill-fated, misbegotten war for abolition. We will not cooperate any longer. You are going to have to open negotiations with the Confederacy. That, I'm afraid, is an entirely likely scenario. And Lee saw that. And Lee saw that was the way the Confederacy would win its independence. He was thinking in that respect strategically, not only in military terms, but he was also thinking strategically in political terms as well. There was a lot of insight and a lot of shrewdness in Lee's evaluation of that situation. And in the result, he nearly pulled it off. I mean, Scott, you talk about Pickett's charge being sort of this low point of Lee's reputation militarily. I'm not quite so convinced of that. I think that what happened at Pickett's charge came within an ace of succeeding. You know, you think about the Battle of Gettysburg. For 2 days, Lee had wrecked the Army of the Potomac. 5 out of the 7 infantry corps of the Army of the Potomac were in a shambles. Each of them had lost a brigade the day before. So we're down to about what? 3,500 men effectively disciplined, ready to repel a Confederate attack. All the odds were in Lee's favor. And if Lee had broken through, well, my goodness, the results. The Army of the Potomac might have gone to pieces. Lee's army would have advanced to the Susquehanna. And perhaps indeed, the Lincoln administration would have had to make some gesture in the direction of peace negotiations. It was, as Wellington said about Waterloo, Gettysburg was a near run thing.
One final question from one of our listeners, Casey, wants to know, what do you think of the city's removing Lee statues, especially the Lee statue along Monument Avenue in Richmond?
Oh, I have to admit to being at sixes and sevens about statue removal, like the Lee statue. I'm at sixes and sevens about them because, for one thing, I'm a historian, so I'm always reluctant to see anything that puts us in mind of our history taken away. On the other hand, as I say, I'm a Yankee from Yankee land, so I have some difficulty understanding why you put up statues in the first place to people who committed treason. I mean, I've had the same problem with people who wave the Confederate flag. Why? Why? These were people who raised their hand against the nation. Why shouldn't the artifacts of the Confederacy have been in any other place but a museum? I mean, if someone wanted to propose erecting a statue to Robert E. Lee today and came to me saying, "Oh, you wrote a biography of Lee, would you please endorse this statue to Robert E. Lee?" I would tell them as politely as I could to get lost. But that's not the whole story. The Lee Monument in Richmond, for instance, dates from the 1890s. And I'm sure that in the 1890s, it had a message about white supremacy then, no question. But it also had some other messages. The South was a region which had lost a crippling civil war. The impact of the war on survivors in the South was worse than the Great Depression. And that lasted for all practical purposes until the 1950s. In American culture, we worship success. If you're successful, that means you're good. If you lose, it means you're bad. It's like what Vince Lombardi said, winning isn't just the most important thing, it's the only thing. Well, the message wrapped up in the Lee statues was the possibility of dignity in the face of defeat. The possibility that the winners are not necessarily always the good, and the people who wind up paying for their deeds are not necessarily bad. That message is wrapped up in the Lee statues. And there's a certain anxiety in my mind that we might regret losing that in the kind of dog eat dog world that we live in. The other thing is that statues change. Which sounds a little strange when I say that, because we think, well, a statue is made of granite or bronze. How can it change? Well, they change in this respect. When the statues are put up, or monuments, like on the Gettysburg battlefield, they serve as memorials. And here's where the white supremacy messages often got attached to Confederate statues. The statues were there to remind people of what the Confederacy was for. Over time, though, the generations pass and the statues change. They begin as memorials, but as the generations pass, they decline into monuments. And the Lee statue becomes a remembrance of a chapter in Virginia's history. And then more generations pass, and the monument declines still further into being simply a marker. People drive down Monument Avenue and they drive around the circle, and they say, "Oh yeah, that's Robert E. Lee, some history dude." Something of the same thing happens to other monuments and memorials and markers. Out in Western Pennsylvania in Washington County, we've got a memorial, a monument to the Whiskey Rebellion. All right, the Whiskey Rebellion is the 1790s. Scott, those Whiskey rebels committed treason. But we have a monument there to them. Yet nobody gets lost over it. Why? Because the whole meaning has changed. It has declined over the years. This is even better. This is out in California, in Donner Park. All right, the Donner Party, the people in 1848, they get caught by the snowstorm, they resort to cannibalism. All right, there's a park there, the Donner Park, and there's a monument to the Donner Party. Right, by the way, right next to a picnic area. I mean, I'm not kidding, all right? You can go there and have a Donner Party barbecue. That monument is there. Now, do people today go and look at that and say, oh, that's celebrating cannibalism? No. What happened there was a long time ago. It was dreadful, but it was a long time ago. Nobody gets upset by that. So monuments change. And these are examples of how the monuments change and how they acquire different meanings, and how sometimes they had different meanings, multiple meanings, even when they were put up. So on the one hand, I'm a historian. I'm reluctant to see monuments and memorials jettisoned. On the other hand, I am a citizen of a democracy. And if the citizens of Richmond determine that there is a monument they wish to remove, I have no legitimate reason for standing in the path of that decision. What I can hope for, though, is that the decision is made reasonably, as the product of a process, not by impulse or by ignorance or by rage. Now, I think that's important because it's often said that ignorance and impulse and rage are unfortunate necessary parts of living in a democracy. I hope that the voices which say that are wrong. And maybe how we deal with our monuments, not just Lee, but all historical memoranda. Maybe the way we deal with our monuments will be the measure of how seriously we take not only our history, but how seriously we take our democracy as well.
I know we've gone over our time here, but I do have to ask this one more question before we leave you tonight. And that is, when you say that monuments change, and you gave the example of someone driving by the Lee statue on Monument Avenue in Richmond and saying, oh, that's Robert E. Lee, some dude in history. Do Black Americans think of it that way?
Oh, no.
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 And that's why I just question.
Right. Oh, yeah. This is why I said the statues embody these multiplicity of memories and meanings. They involve change in those meanings as well. And what I would hope is that any decision we make about monuments takes into account the full spectrum of all of those changes, all of those meanings, all of those symbols. Here's one of my favorites from the Gettysburg battlefield. There's a monument on the Gettysburg battlefield to the 42nd New York Volunteers. The monument, Scott, shows an Indian chieftain and a teepee.
Yeah.
And you look at this and think, wait a minute, these people got the wrong war?
Yeah.
The answer is no. Actually, the 42nd New York was the so-called Tammany Hall Regiment. The funding for raising the regiment had come from Tammany Hall in New York City. And of course, the symbol of Tammany Hall is Chief Tammany, hence the Indian chieftain and the teepee. People drive past that monument every day on the battlefield, and I doubt whether they draw any of those conclusions or lines of thought back to Chief Tammany. On the other hand, are there people who look at that and say, well, I'm grievously offended for the sake of Chief Tammany? Why is that monument there? No, it's because monuments change over time. They embody different meanings over time. And as we try to wrestle with the question of statues and what statues should stand and what should not, let's be careful that we're taking the full story into account and not just one moment or one reaction or one impulse. Because impulse is the thing that is opposed to reason, and reason is the thing which ultimately, when it is subtracted, takes the life out of democracy. Democracy thrives on reason and being able to reason with each other. That's what democracy assumes, that we're all capable of reasoning with each other. So maybe the end point of a reasonable process is, yeah, take it down. Fine. But let it be a reasonable process so that we know that we really are living in and honoring a democracy.
The book is Robert E. Lee, A Life by Dr. Alan Guelzo. Dr. Guelzo, thank you very much for the conversation. We could probably go on a little bit longer, but I'll turn it over to Alex now.
Scott, Alan, thank you so much for this really, really wonderful conversation. Alan, congratulations on your book. The book is titled Robert E. Lee: A Life. Alan, do you have the book with you? Do you want to show it up on the screen real here? Quick.
Here it is.
Now out this week in hardcover. We do have signed copies available for purchase. If you look in the chat room, I provided a link there, or simply head to midtownscholar.com. Thank you to our audience members, for everyone who tuned in. Thank you for your questions. And once again, thank you, Scott and Alan. And Alan, I'd just like to give you the last word to our audience.
Last word is that our history means a great deal to us. What we are as a people depends so much on our history. As Americans, we don't identify ourselves by a race, by a religion, by an ethnicity, by a language, by a religion. We identify ourselves by what we have been. We are the only nation, we are the only nation that can tell the exact time and day when we were born. And remembering that history is our lifeline. So for the sake of the study of history, for the sake of the health of our democracy, let's keep a tenacious hold on our history. Let's respect it, let's investigate it, let's critique it, and let's revere it. Critique it where it needs to be critiqued, revere it where it has really been one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of the planet.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.